In this video, I want to talk about knitting, loom knitting, lucet knitting, knitting Nancy's, and spool knitting, and something that I think people should be aware of when they buy looms for knitting, knitting Nancy's, or even lucets. Now, in the picture here, let me move the lucets out of the way for a moment. I have several sock patterns written for circular needles, straight needles, crochet. All of them go by the size of the needle or the hook and the gauge of the yarn. When you look at a spool knitter, such as a Knitting Nancy, you will see that the pins, and let me get a background where you can see them, the pins are shaped in an upside down U. They're about 1/4 of an inch wide, and the reason the Knitting Nancy gives you a nice strand of yarn is because of the width of the pins. Now, some of my spool knitters have nails for pins, and in fact originally nails were used as the pins. And again, you have the straight nail, and then you have the head of the nail is a flat circle, but it's not very wide. Now, recently I started making a pair of socks on this loom, and I got frustrated because it was knitting too tight. I started with the flat stitch, and I didn't like how tight it was coming out, so I went to an E-wrap stitch, and I didn't see a big difference, and I'll explain why. This is an authentic knitting board sock loom. It's a wonderful loom. The metal pins at the top have a circle shape to make it easier to knit, and there's a channel in the pins. But when you think about it, your width of your stitch, no matter what gauge or what the pin spacing is, your stitch is only going to be as big as the top pin, the top of the pin. Now, they have these pins manufactured and set in the loom so that the round part of the pin is on the side. So there's one loom. Here is their 10-inch knitting board. Again, I love these looms. They're wonderful looms. And they have ball pins, and you can see that the width of the stitch is only going to be as wide as the ball on the top. Now, when you change the spacing for a thicker or a thinner yarn, you're adapting your yarn and your board to each other, but your stitch is still only going to be as big as the top of the pin. And if I could put that one down. This is a sock loom I made myself. I ordered a frame with the holes drilled from DA Looms, and then I set the pins myself using cotter pins. Now, instead of having the pins straight on so that the circle area at the top was narrow, I set them at an angle, which gives me a wider stitch over the top, and this loom knits better than the professional ones because I have a wider stitch at the top. When I make my spool looms, these are, Lion Brand Yarn has a page on how to make a knitting spool out of Sculpey clay, which I've made several. I again use cotter pins, but I open them up so that they're more like the Knitting Nancy pins. And that means, obviously, I can change the gauge by the spacing and the yarn, but I'm at least going to have 1/4 of an inch at the top for my stitch size. So then we come to lucets. And lucets are different. Most of them are shaped like this. I have a couple of different types of lucets, but with a lucet, your stitch is really however wide the two prongs are and how tight you pull the yarn. It's all about your actual knitting gauge and how tight you pull it. I can lucet yarn very loosely and get a nice loose strand of yarn, or I can do it very tightly and get a traditional cord. So with the lucet, it's a little bit different because it depends on how tight you pull it. But if you look at the small round lucets, there are small round ones, and I'm about to carve this one. If I leave these wide, I'm going to have a bigger stitch. If I carve them very narrow, I'm going to have a narrower stitch, and it's going to depend more on how far apart they are. And what I'm doing today is making a spool knitter, but I'm taking all of that thinking and I'm doing something different with it. This is part of my tree that I took down, and I drilled a hole, and I have to finish the hole. I used a saw to cut a piece out here and a piece out here, which left me with 4 pegs, and I was going to carve the pegs so that it would be like a traditional corker. But when I started thinking about all the stitch width, so this will be for like heavier weight yarns because of the gauge of the loom. Excuse me. But I still want a big stitch. This is going to be probably for cotton. And cotton is difficult to knit on a spool knitter because it doesn't have as much stretch as wool. So you'll see I've got pilot holes drilled here. And I actually have 2 of them, and I'm going to take out that little piece of wood between them. And this is going to be my pin. And I'm going to mount 4 keys like that, and what that's going to give me is that wide of a stitch when I go over the key with the stitch. And that will keep me, it'll force me to knit the cotton loosely. And because if you use a traditional knitting Nancy to knit cotton, you end up struggling with it because it knits tighter than wool. It is just a fact. By putting an oversized pin top on, it's going to keep me from over knitting any cotton yarn. You know, you can get sugar and cream cotton yarn in cones by Lily, which is a wonderful yarn. It's very soft cotton yarn. But if you're going to struggle with it on a regular knitting Nancy, then it gets frustrating. So this is my first one like this. I could actually make a larger one, either out of wood or clay or something, and put keys all around the top, and have a larger knitter specifically for cotton. So it's something to think about when you're buying spool knitters, when you're looking at them, when you're buying looms. I'm sure that Authentic Knitting Board, Boy, Nifty Knitter, that they've all done their research. The best round looms I ever had were the In the Attic flexible looms, which aren't available anymore, and they're very expensive if you can find them. They had like a cup shape at the top of the peg, very similar to this idea. They had a very wide, if the pin was as wide as my finger, then the cup shape at the top was that wide, and it was an easier way to knit. So it's something to think about when you're making or buying spool knitters or knitting looms.